Okay. Welcome everyone to SIG Instrumentation Biweekly. Today is March 2nd, 2023. We have a couple things on the agenda. Hold on, let me share my screen. Make sure I share the right thing, because otherwise I can get in trouble. There we go. All right, so let me. Zoom does weird things once you start projecting it, like changes your views and then like everyone disappears into like a little box. It's like, I don't know who wrote their UI, but it is a little janky. Okay, so welcome everyone. We have two items on the agenda. The first is Tim's on categorized request metrics. Do you want to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So this is, we can maybe think of it as like pre-KEP. I'm just trying to kind of gauge interest on this idea, if it's worth exploring this further and maybe getting a KEP out in 128 or 129. It's not kind of an urgent issue. But just kind of the problem statement, I with some frequency find myself wishing that I could break down our request metrics by namespace or user, requesting user, yeah, I guess those are the main two ones. Maybe occasionally like resource name, but that's less common. But we can't actually have metrics with labels for those fields because of cardinality issues. So I was thinking about like what a solution to this might look like, and came up with this idea for having a static, although we could probably discuss a dynamic version as well, definition of different categories of request. So for instance, if I want to say like, I'm going to classify these requests as system requests. They're for things in Cube system, or they're made from system components. Maybe there's a couple cluster scoped resources that I explicitly want to include. And so any request that matches any of these patterns in the include in the example below gets essentially labeled or categorized as system. And then we can emit a metric that is, what did I call it? API server categorized request total. So this is basically the API server request total metric, but with an additional dimension, which is category. And that's the kind of like, so in this case, those requests would get categorized as system and increment that count. And so the idea would be, everyone, what every cluster operator, cloud provider considers to be system requests is going to be a little different. It depends on which plugins you've installed, what you consider to be workloads versus what you consider to be part of running a cluster. And so it lets the cluster operator define this group of requests that I care about measuring explicitly, and sort of a build your own metric around it.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Would your intent to be to scrape these metrics, or would you look at them manually?
Scrape them, yeah.
I mean, the problem with scraping them is that you end up with the same cardinality issues, right? Like,
so
because we have cardinality issues like locally on the client, because you basically bloat the memory usage of the API server by having like a zillion metric time series. And the same thing happens on Prometheus or cloud monitoring or wherever, right? Whatever your backend may be. So like even if we were to enable this, like scraping it could very well be potentially problematic.
Yeah, that's a good argument against the dynamic version, I think. With the static version, the assumption is that every cluster that I care about would have the same definition of metrics categorization.
So I have a like I've thought about this problem a lot since you brought this up, like actually quite a while ago in the SIG Instrumentation Slack channel. So I've thought about it a lot. Like I think I would be okay with this if it was not dynamic, and if this were exposed on a different scraping endpoint, which would be enableable or disableable by a command line flag on the API server. So like basically enable high cardinality metrics or something, and then you can enable them with the caveat that like you probably don't want to leave this enabled in a long running cluster because you're likely to eventually.
Yeah,
would this be,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure that this would be higher cardinality on a given cluster than
if it's identical to API server request total and it has namespace, it will be higher cardinality.
No, so it doesn't have namespace. So the only extra label dimension that's being added here is category. And category is a statically defined string. So in the example here, there's a category called system. And so that includes cube namespace, but the namespace isn't being included there. That just gets a request that's in the cube system namespace gets labeled system. And it's just that system piece that gets recorded.
But a simpler thing would actually just to put namespace there, right? And then you could do this categorization on the monitoring backend side.
Yes, but then you do run into much higher cardinality issues. And
and I'm saying like even this is higher cardinality because if you include these three types of categories, that's 3xing. That's basically 3xing the cardinality of API server request matrix, which is basically a third of the total of the metric. It's basically like API server request total.
That's the latency one.
The latency one is a third,
because like latency, for example, is like 10 times the cardinality of API request.
But the conjunction of the two, I think, account for about 33% of the total.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that as long as we have a finite amount of values for this label, it should be fine. Because like most of the problem we've run into so far have been because of cardinality explosion. Like the actual footprint hasn't been that important. Like people have been reporting that the latency metric is like really heavy, like actually consume a lot of memory on their backend. But we're always able to tell them that, well, this
you could drop labels.
And even like it's such an important metric that you need to spend that much memory to save it, because like it will tell you the health of your cluster essentially. So yeah, I think it's reasonable, and I have like many use cases for that kind of usage. Like for example, here we are creating groups with namespace and user agent or like user group. I have other use cases where it could be good, like to add new labels for a finite amount of namespace. Let's say you group namespace together and put a value for them.
Even if you were to have namespaces, you can only have so many namespaces. It's practically bound. And so like,
but that's why it's important to have a list of values.
This is a high card. Yeah, we already have we already have the ability to truncate and group label values. Right? Like
How
dynamically.
we do that? How?
We can limit, we can specify known acceptable values and put everything in another. We had a cap for this dynamic label.
That's possible, but like it doesn't allow you to add new dimensions that are unbounded by design, by default, and that you can bound via a configuration.
No. What I'm saying is you can probably do this thing using using namespace. If we were to duplicate API server request total, add namespace, then use our filter, we could probably get this result. Is what I'm saying.
That's super dangerous because like then you
no, it's literally the same thing.
It's the same. It's the same.
Yeah, it is the same thing.
Yeah, as long as it's on a different endpoint and you have to actually
exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So if it's on a separate endpoint, like we have this dynamic cardinality limiter thing. Basically, because people have exploded metrics so many times, we've enabled this flag, which allows you to bound a label to a certain known set of values, and then to cluster those and put everything else into another group. That way, the memory ends up getting constrained, which in conjunction with this gives you something very similar to this, right? Without actually having to implement much except maybe duplicating this, adding a namespace label, and putting it on a separate endpoint. And so basically, I'm suggesting something simpler than this, right? Which is you basically want to know the namespace, and you're worried about the namespace cardinality. And I'm actually
the user IDs is maybe an important
user IDs. Oh, well. User IDs is tricky. That's completely unbounded. I mean, like, look, even completely unbounded stuff, I'm okay with in an external toggleable metrics endpoint, because like you're only enabling this for short durations of time, right? So like your concerns about like ooming and crash looping the API server goes out the window because you're doing this on purpose.
Well, I mean, let me go in a little more depth in the specific use case that I'm looking for here. I'd like to be able to set and come up with an SLO across our fleet of clusters for what is the error rate on system requests. I don't have a concise definition of system requests, but essentially requests that are made by components that we fully manage as part of GKE.
But you don't want, do you need latencies?
No.
Well, then why can't you make a simpler metric which only has that dimension and the error code?
That would probably be enough. I think it would be useful to have information like which resource was failing, which verb. But I suppose like if we just had the bare minimum metric of category and code, then we could pull that information out of logs.
And you could also look at the other API server request total metric to look at like the distribution of requests, and then basically kind of do an inference, right? For your use case, I would almost just go with the simpler metric and bypass all this stuff, because this is too complicated to. It sounds like you can achieve that with the simpler metric, the thing that you want.
The simpler metric being, it would have the code and namespace and user, you're saying?
Yeah, not user, because user is unbounded.
And we have a regex for on the thing that we have to bound the label values. Does it support regex today?
No.
Let's say you want to map, because if we could map let's say all the users that kind of match a regex into a new user, then we could limit the number of value it takes.
Well, it would need to support multiple regex. That's the cap in it of itself.
Yeah. But that's the only way to enable to have at least the user group as a label.
That's a cap in and of itself. But yeah, so I could get you everything except the user, and the user would be a problem even if we did something more complicated, it would still be a problem, right? Because you're going to have cardinality. Users is unbounded. Like there's no practical cap on users, right? Like namespaces there is because of etcd and the size quota and whatever, and like discovery falling over if you have too many namespaces, there's like namespaces is practically bounded. Users are not practically bounded, and in a metric you're going to have cardinality concerns, and the only way I would be okay with users being in a metric is if it was in a separate endpoint and it was toggleable and it was not going to be enabled permanently, because you would basically the API server.
Yeah, well, that's why I like this approach of mapping that unbounded set of users to just statically defined bounded set of values.
I mean, you can do that with a regular metric though. I mean, like you can have a metric called, okay, what do you call this thing that you're trying to measure? Like, what are you trying to measure?
System error rate.
System error rate. Okay, system error rate. You have a metric. And then basically in that metric, you pass in the user, you pass in the namespace, and you pass in the error code, right? If there is an error. And then in your function, you take the user and then you put it into a group. That requires none of this, right? Like it requires request metrics categorization manifest. You don't need that. You can just write that in code in your metric.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you cannot really do that upstream though.
Yeah, sure you can. Why not?
But what's
PNF is a valid thing, right? There's a default PNF setting upstream. So I would imagine this would be completely configurable, right? Like you could read your PNF settings and then throw the stuff into you could call your PNF settings and then put stuff in the right groups, right?
Sorry, are you talking about priority and fairness?
Yeah. That's what this is about, right?
Well, so funny you should mention that. So that's what we're thinking about using as a proxy for this right now is I don't think we have a priority and fairness metric that has error code attached to it. So we might be able to get away with just doing that. But what we're looking at right now is just aggregating a metric out of the HTTP logs from the API.
And that also works, right? Like, yeah, I mean, like cloud monitoring has the log-based metrics, which is super nice.
Yeah.
For high cardinality stuff, but yeah, but you end up doing the same sort of transforms where you're like putting stuff into groups. So
we can keep it. I mean, we have ways of doing this outside of the API server.
Right.
I guess what I was trying to gauge was like, is there interest in having something like this built in?
I mean, there would have to be like a real compelling use case for it. And I would support building it if there was like a real compelling use case where like we could not solve this problem otherwise, right?
Okay.
But it sounds like we can probably solve this otherwise, given our conversation.
Yeah.
Does that sort of resolve the thing for you, or?
Yeah, I think that gives me what I need.
Okay. Yeah, and if you want me to show you like what I mean by like so in the body of like where you're recording the metric, like record this metric, you pass in these parameters, and then you have like this call to recording the metric. But before that body, right, you can just make a call to PNF settings, get all of the user groups, which are in workload status, and then do like a set inclusion, and then put it into that workload status. You could do something like that. And you could even cache those values so that you're not making that call every single time when you're right. And then basically you've basically taken your users, and then you have put them into a known bound set of groups.
Yeah, you're talking about doing all of this client side or in the API
like
server?
Literally in code.
In the API server?
Yeah.
Okay.
And dynamically, right? Because like PNF settings can be dynamically set.
That would be adding a new metric that you're talking about.
That would be adding a new metric, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we can do this with API request code. We definitely can't add namespace to it because the cardinality is so high.
It's stable anyway.
Yeah, it's stable, and the cardinality is so high. It just like people complain about our API server request matrix today. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a cardinality explosion like maybe 2 years ago with a namespace that was attached to a request, and it like downstream you got like more than
for scalability tests they keep like creating and deleting namespaces. So basically what happens when you include a namespace label is that the scalability tests tend to the API server because of the namespace. So we might not actually be able to ever use namespace as a label value. It'll just fail scalability tests unless it was on a separate endpoint that was toggleable. Then scalability tests would be okay.
Yeah.
It looks like there's another
like only one dimension.
It looks like there's another item on the agenda, so I can cede the floor.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Okay, the next one is mentorship plan. Okay, yeah, sure. Let's open up the mentorship plan. So we have a bunch of volunteers for mentorship. And we have several people interested. So how should we do assignments?
I don't know really. Even like there might be areas where there is only one person to mentor, so that would be easy.
How about this? Since we have 6 minutes left, if you guys are on and you guys have if the people who want a mentor would like, please fill out your desired mentor. If there is a slot, then you can do it. So I guess it'll be first come, first serve. And that way we can distribute them that way.
Should we temporarily remove David since he won't be here?
Yes, David should be out because David is hold on, how do I do? Okay, there we go. And I feel like Elena might only be able to handle one, but I don't know. She wrote this. She's out today too. But yeah. So if you guys are interested in a mentor, please fill this out. And then over the course of the next week, we will check this list and then proactively reach out to you. If you guys can include your Slack handle, then we'll reach out to you via Slack. And then we'll arrange a one-on-one, and then we can get started that way.
Yep.
How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's basically it for today, and we have about 3 minutes left. Is there anything else anyone wants to talk about? All right, then we can call it for today's meeting. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, bye.